Each year, military chaplains from armed forces around the world file confidential reports describing spiritual encounters that defy rational explanation and challenge the fundamental assumptions that modern warfare operates solely within the realm of physical combat between human adversaries. It occurs so frequently that the U.S. Army Chief of Chaplains maintains a classified archive containing over 3,000 documented cases of what are euphemistically termed anomalous spiritual warfare incidents, ranging from unexplained protections during combat to encounters with entities that seem to exist outside the normal boundaries of material reality. The Iraq War, which began with Operation Iraqi Freedom in March 2003, and would ultimately claim over 4,400 American lives before official combat operations ended in 2011, created conditions where ancient history collided with modern military technology in ways that neither Pentagon strategists nor religious scholars had anticipated or prepared for when they authorized the establishment of forward operating bases on ground that had been considered sacred, cursed, or forbidden by successive civilizations spanning over 5,000 years of recorded human history. Firebase Eden, designated as Forward Operating Base 47 Delta in official military communications, was established in late September 2003, approximately 85 kilometers south of Baghdad in the Babel Governorate, positioned less than 3 kilometers from the archaeological ruins of ancient Babylon, one of the most significant and spiritually charged locations in human civilization, where the Tower of Babel supposedly challenged heaven itself, and where the Book of Revelation prophesied would become the dwelling place of demons and every unclean spirit when judgment finally came upon the earth. But for the 140 soldiers of Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, who were assigned to secure this strategic position along the Euphrates River and protect archaeological sites from looters during the chaotic aftermath of Saddam Hussein's regime collapse, the real threat wouldn't come from insurgent attacks or improvised explosive devices planted along patrol routes, but rather from something that had been sealed beneath Babylonian soil for millennia, waiting with patient malevolence for the day when modern soldiers would dig deep enough to break ancient seals and open doorways that every civilization since the Sumerians had warned should remain permanently closed. What exactly emerged from beneath Firebase Eden during those 72 hours in October 2003? And why did an entire company of American soldiers simply vanish from official military records, their families told they died in classified operations that couldn't be discussed even decades after the incident, their names struck from casualty lists as if they had never existed at all? The ancient city of Babylon, located in what is now central Iraq, approximately 85 kilometers south of modern Baghdad, sprawls across nearly 10 square kilometers of archaeological significance that represents one of humanity's earliest attempts at organized urban civilization, where the Hanging Gardens once stood as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and where King Nebuchadnezzar II built walls so massive that chariots could race along their tops. The region sits in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the very concept of written language was invented by Sumerian priests who recorded not just mundane transactions, but also warnings about entities that existed before humanity and would exist long after. Beings they called Anunnaki, or those who from heaven came, but which later Babylonian texts described with terms that translated more accurately as the Watchers Beneath, or the imprisoned ones who wait in darkness. The soil itself carries a distinctive reddish-brown hue that modern geologists attribute to high iron oxide content, but ancient Mesopotamian texts insisted the color came from the blood of fallen angels who had been cast down from heaven during a war that predated human creation, making the earth itself a prison designed to contain spiritual entities too dangerous to be allowed freedom, but too powerful to be completely destroyed. As is common throughout the Middle East, the history of spiritual warfare in the Babylon region extends back long before Islam, Christianity, or even Judaism brought their particular interpretations of good and evil to this crossroads of civilization. Sumerian cuneiform tablets dating to approximately 3500 BCE describe the construction of Temen Enki, the Tower of Babel mentioned in Genesis, but provide significantly more detail than biblical accounts, explaining that the tower wasn't built to reach heaven, but rather to serve as a massive seal covering a chasm that led down into Kur, the underworld realm where 7 judges ruled over the dead, and where entities called Gala demons waited for any opportunity to escape into the world of the living and possess human bodies as vessels for experiencing physical sensation they had been denied since their imprisonment at the dawn of creation, the famous Ishtar Gate, portions of which still stand in the ruins of Babylon, and which was reconstructed by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, wasn't merely a ceremonial entrance to the city but rather served as a spiritual barrier, reinforced through annual rituals where priests would renew protective wards using ceremonies described in texts that combined what modern observers would recognize as both religious prayer and practical magic designed to maintain the integrity of seals that kept dimensional boundaries stable and prevented crossover between the realm of matter and the realm of pure spiritual energy. The warnings about Babylon's spiritual danger weren't limited to ancient Mesopotamian sources, but appear consistently across multiple religious traditions that normally disagree on virtually every other theological point, suggesting that whatever existed beneath Babylonian soil was significant enough to be recognized as a genuine threat by civilizations separated by centuries and thousands of miles. The Hebrew prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah both described Babylon as a dwelling place for demons and unclean spirits, with Isaiah chapter 13 specifically stating, "Wild beasts of the desert shall lie there, and their houses shall be full of doleful creatures, and owls shall dwell there, and satyrs shall dance there," using terminology that ancient Hebrew scholars understood to reference not animals, but rather spiritual entities that took physical form when dimensional barriers weakened. The Book of Revelation, written centuries after Babylon's political power had collapsed, still identified the city as spiritually significant enough to serve as the symbolic representation of ultimate evil and the dwelling place of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird, suggesting that early Christians believed something genuinely demonic remained imprisoned beneath the ruins long after the last Babylonian king had died and the ziggurats had crumbled into dust. Perhaps most telling were the Islamic hadiths that emerged in the 7th century CE, over 1,000 years after Babylon's golden age had ended, which specifically warned believers against settling in the ruins of the ancient city, claiming that the Prophet Muhammad himself had identified the location as one of several places on earth where the barrier between the material world and Jahannam, Islamic hell, had grown dangerously thin due to accumulated evil and the presence of imprisoned jinn, who had been bound there by King Solomon using the power of God's most secret names. On the afternoon of October 8, 2003, at approximately 14:30 hours, Captain Michael Shepard Garrett, a 32-year-old company commander from rural Georgia, who had earned his nickname through his habit of quoting scripture during mission briefings, authorized a combat engineering team to begin excavating a defensive bunker on the southeastern perimeter of Firebase Eden, selecting a location that offered excellent sightlines toward the nearby ruins of Babylon, while also providing natural protection from the prevailing wind patterns that carried choking desert sand across the compound during the frequent dust storms that plagued the region. Staff Sergeant Thomas Dust Davidson, a construction equipment operator from Nevada with 12 years of Army engineering experience, was supervising the excavation using a Caterpillar backhoe when the bucket struck something solid approximately 4 meters below the surface, producing a metallic ringing sound that echoed across the Firebase compound with an unusual resonance that seemed to vibrate at frequencies that made soldiers' teeth ache and caused inexplicable headaches among personnel within a 100-meter radius. When Davidson cleared away the surrounding soil to investigate what he initially assumed was buried ordnance, or perhaps an undiscovered archaeological artifact that would require the involvement of the Coalition Provisional Authority's Heritage Protection Team, what emerged was a massive stone slab approximately 3 meters square, covered in cuneiform inscriptions that glowed faintly with a phosphorescent blue light, despite being buried in complete darkness, for what geological analysis would later suggest had been over 2,500 years based on sediment layering and mineralization patterns that indicated the stone had been deliberately placed and sealed during the Neo-Babylonian period, when King Nebuchadnezzar II ruled the ancient city. The excavation attracted immediate attention from Lieutenant Rachel Prophet Morrison, the company's intelligence officer and a former archaeology graduate student from Yale, who had enlisted after 9/11 and whose academic background in ancient Near Eastern studies made her uniquely qualified to recognize that the inscriptions on the stone slab weren't decorative or commemorative, but rather appeared to be protective warnings written in Old Babylonian cuneiform, a script that predated even the famous Code of Hammurabi, and which required specialized expertise to translate accurately. Morrison photographed the inscriptions and spent the next 3 hours cross-referencing her digital archive of linguistic resources, growing increasingly disturbed as the translations revealed phrases that repeated variations of the same warning across all 4 edges of the stone slab. Do not break the seal of the 7 watchers. The imprisoned ones wait in eternal hunger. Blood and fire sealed this gate. Only blood and fire can open it. And most ominously, those who disturb this threshold shall become doorways themselves, vessels for the ancient ones who were cast down before humanity drew its first breath. What made Morrison's blood run cold wasn't just the content of the warnings, but the realization that the stone slab wasn't covering a burial chamber or treasure vault, as typical archaeological seals would indicate, but rather appeared to be blocking an entrance to something that continued downward into the earth, with hairline cracks around the edges of the stone suggesting the presence of an open space beneath, a void that released faint wisps of warm air carrying a sulfurous odor, reminiscent of volcanic vents mixed with something organic and rotting, that made every soldier who approached the excavation site feel inexplicably nauseated and anxious. Captain Garrett, whose religious upbringing had instilled both a healthy respect for biblical warnings about places like Babylon and a soldier's practical understanding that sometimes the simplest solution is to leave dangerous things alone, made the immediate decision to halt the excavation and cover the stone slab with the excavated soil, reasoning that whatever lay beneath had been successfully contained for over 2 millennia. And there was no tactical advantage to be gained by disturbing seals that ancient civilizations had gone to considerable effort to establish and maintain. But that decision came approximately 45 minutes too late, because the initial impact of the backhoe bucket against the stone surface had already created microfractures in the seal's integrity hairline cracks that widened imperceptibly over the following hours as pressure from below exploited the weakness in a barrier that had been designed to remain intact indefinitely, but which couldn't maintain its protective function once compromised by modern machinery operating with forces that ancient engineers had never anticipated or planned to resist. The first undeniable sign that something had fundamentally changed came at approximately 2145 hours that same evening, when Private First Class Thomas Preacher Hayes, a 19-year-old military policeman from Tennessee who had been assigned to sentry duty on the southeastern perimeter, reported hearing sounds emanating from the location where the excavation had been conducted, and then filled in with explicit orders that no one was to approach the area without direct authorization from Captain Garrett himself. Hayes described the sounds as a combination of breathing and whispers, but not the normal respiratory sounds of animals or humans, rather something that reminded him of wind blowing through a massive cave system, rhythmic exhalations that seemed to come from deep underground, and which carried fragments of voices speaking in languages he couldn't identify, but which produced emotional responses of fear and revulsion that transcended linguistic comprehension. When Sergeant Davidson accompanied Hayes to investigate bringing a spotlight and recording equipment to document whatever might be creating the disturbance, both men reported experiencing a sudden temperature increase of approximately 15 degrees Celsius within a 5-meter radius of the covered excavation site, an impossible thermal anomaly in the desert night where temperatures typically dropped rapidly after sunset, and where the surrounding area maintained the expected cool conditions while this localized zone felt like standing near an active furnace or walking into a room where a fire had just been extinguished. The soil covering the stone slab had begun to crack and settle, not from natural compaction but rather from movement occurring beneath the surface, as if pressure was being applied from below in pulsing waves that corresponded with the breathing sounds, Hayes had reported, and when Davidson trained his spotlight on the disturbed earth, both soldiers clearly saw the soil rippling in concentric patterns that radiated outward from the center of the covered slab, like water responding to something large, swimming just beneath the surface. Captain Garrett arrived at the site within minutes of receiving Davidson's radio report, accompanied by Lieutenant Morrison and Chaplain Major David Father O'Connell, a 45-year-old Catholic priest from Boston who had served as a military chaplain for over 15 years and who carried both an M9 pistol and a rosary, blessed by the Archbishop of Boston, representing the duality of his role as both spiritual counselor and armed soldier serving in a combat zone. O'Connell performed what he described as a precautionary blessing of the site, reciting prayers in Latin while sprinkling holy water that he maintained specifically for situations where he felt spiritual protection might be necessary, though he admitted afterward that the traditional Catholic rituals felt inadequate and somehow wrong for this particular situation, as if he was attempting to address a threat that predated Christianity by thousands of years, and which operated according to spiritual rules that the Church had never encountered or developed effective countermeasures against during its 2,000-year history. The blessing appeared to have no effect whatsoever on the phenomenon, and if anything seemed to agitate whatever presence had begun manifesting at the excavation site, because immediately after O'Connell completed his prayers and made the sign of the cross over the disturbed soil, the temperature increased further until it became painful to stand near the covered stone slab, and the breathing sounds escalated into something that resembled choking or gagging, as if whatever existed beneath the seal was attempting to force its way through an opening that remained too narrow for easy passage, but which grew slightly wider with each labored exhalation. The breakthrough into undeniable horror came at precisely 23:12 hours, when Private First Class Daniel Angel Martinez, a young soldier from Los Angeles who had been standing approximately 10 meters from the excavation site providing security while Captain Garrett assessed the situation, suddenly collapsed to the ground screaming in a voice that started as his familiar tenor, but rapidly descended into frequencies that human vocal cords shouldn't be capable of producing, a sound that combined agony with something that might have been ecstasy, or perhaps the joy of something finally achieving freedom after an imprisonment that had lasted longer than human civilization. Martinez's body began convulsing violently while his eyes rolled back to show only whites, and when Chaplain O'Connell and the unit's combat medic, Sergeant Amy Doc Smith from San Francisco, rushed to provide assistance, they found the young soldier's skin burning to the touch despite the cool night air, his temperature registering at 41 degrees Celsius on the medic's digital thermometer, approaching the threshold where brain damage becomes inevitable if the fever isn't immediately reduced. But more disturbing than the physical symptoms was what happened when Martinez's eyes suddenly snapped forward to focus on the soldiers gathered around him, because the pupils had completely disappeared, replaced by solid black that filled the entire visible portion of the eyeball. And when he spoke, the voice that emerged combined Martinez's familiar Spanish-accented English with an undertone that sounded like multiple speakers talking simultaneously in perfect synchronization, creating a chorus effect that made it impossible to identify any single source for the words that began spilling from his mouth. Finally, a doorway opens. Flesh to inhabit, so long waiting in the darkness below, so many others waiting to rise. Let us in. Let us all in. This one's faith makes him weak. Perfect vessel. He invited us with his prayers. Captain Garrett's 15 years of military service had prepared him for conventional combat scenarios, insurgent tactics, and even chemical weapons threats. But as he watched Private Martinez's body thrash on the ground, while multiple voices spoke simultaneously through the young soldier's mouth, his training provided absolutely no framework for responding to a situation that appeared to be genuine demonic possession, occurring in real time on an American military installation. The captain's first instinct was to secure Martinez in the Firebase's medical facility and request immediate psychiatric evaluation and possible medevac to a field hospital with neurological specialists. But when 4 soldiers attempted to physically restrain the possessed private and transport him away from the excavation site, Martinez demonstrated strength that was physiologically impossible for his 68-kilogram frame, throwing off grown men who outweighed him by 30 kilograms, and breaking Sergeant Davidson's wrist with a casual backhand strike that should have been a glancing blow, but which impacted with force comparable to being hit with a metal pipe. More disturbing than the superhuman strength was the fact that Martinez seemed to be fighting against the possession from within, his face alternating between expressions of demonic satisfaction and genuine terror as his own consciousness struggled to regain control, his voice switching mid-sentence from the chorus of entities to his own desperate pleading. "Captain, sir, it's in my head. Get it out. Oh God, it's showing me things that happened here. Thousands of years, not so many screams, now please. Kill me before it takes full control. I can feel it learning how to use my body. It's accessing my training, my memories of the Firebase layout. Oh Christ, it knows everything I know." Lieutenant Morrison, recognizing that traditional Western approaches to the situation were proving worse than useless, made the crucial decision to consult with local Iraqi civilians who had been employed by the Coalition Provisional Authority to serve as cultural advisors and interpreters for military units operating in the Babylon region. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source, an elderly man named Karim al-Nasiri, a 67-year-old former professor of ancient history at Baghdad University, whose family had lived in the shadow of Babylon's ruins for over 20 generations, and who possessed knowledge that combined academic expertise with folk wisdom, passed down through centuries of oral tradition about the dangers that slumbered beneath the ancient city's foundations. When al-Nasiri was brought to the Firebase and shown photographs of the inscriptions on the stone slab, his reaction was immediate and visceral, backing away from the images while making protective gestures and reciting prayers in Arabic that Morrison recognized as Quranic verses specifically associated with protection against jinn and demonic influence. Through the interpreter, al-Nasiri explained that the stone seal was one of 7 that King Nebuchadnezzar II had commissioned during the final years of his reign, following a series of prophetic dreams that warned him about entities imprisoned beneath Babylon since the time of the Tower of Babel. Beings that ancient Sumerian texts called Gala demons, but which the professor suggested might be better understood as something the Quran referenced as the shayatin, fallen angels, who had been cast down from heaven and bound in specific locations around the earth where the barrier between dimensions grew thin due to accumulated spiritual corruption from human violence and suffering. What made al-Nasiri's account particularly credible was his detailed knowledge of historical events that seemed to correlate with previous instances when the seals beneath Babylon had been accidentally or deliberately compromised, creating brief windows of opportunity for the imprisoned entities to influence the physical world before emergency resealing operations could be implemented by those who understood the danger. The professor produced photocopies of translated texts describing an incident in 485 BCE, when Persian soldiers occupying Babylon had damaged one of the seals during construction of military fortifications, resulting in a 3-day period of mass possession, affecting over 50 soldiers who displayed the same symptoms now being observed in Private Martinez: black eyes, superhuman strength, multiple voices speaking through single bodies, and most importantly, retained military training combined with coordinated tactical behavior, suggesting the possessing entities could communicate with each other and formulate strategy despite occupying separate physical vessels. The Persian incident had been resolved only through the intervention of Zoroastrian priests who performed extensive purification rituals involving fire-specific prayers in Avestan language, and ultimately the sacrifice of 7 bulls whose blood was used to reconsecrate the damaged seal and force the escaped entities back into their underground prison. Similar incidents were documented during Alexander the Great's occupation of Babylon in 323 BCE, during the Roman period around 116 CE, and most recently during World War I, when Ottoman troops had conducted excavations near the Ishtar Gate and experienced unexplained casualties attributed officially to disease, but which local records suggested were actually possession events that had been quietly dealt with through Islamic exorcism rituals performed by military imams who understood that conventional medicine had no answer for spiritual warfare. Al-Nasiri's most disturbing revelation came when he explained that the traditional Islamic exorcism techniques that had proven effective in previous centuries would likely be insufficient for the current situation, because those earlier incidents had involved only minor breaches of individual seals that allowed small numbers of entities to escape temporarily before being forced back into containment. The Americans, through their use of modern excavation equipment and the accidental application of significant force against the stone slab, had created a more substantial fracture that was widening progressively as pressure from below exploited the weakness, potentially allowing dozens or even hundreds of imprisoned entities to escape simultaneously once the seal collapsed completely. The professor described a prophecy recorded in medieval Islamic manuscripts that spoke of a time when the gates of Babylon would shatter, and the legions of the damned would walk among men wearing stolen flesh, an event that would herald either the end of days or a period of unprecedented spiritual warfare that would test humanity's faith across all religious traditions. According to al-Nasiri's interpretation of these prophecies, the only reliable method for resealing a majorly compromised gate wasn't through prayer or holy water or traditional exorcism, but rather through the same method that had created the original seals, a combination of specific sacrificial rituals described in Sumerian cuneiform tablets, the use of ancient binding formulas spoken in languages that predated Arabic or Hebrew or Greek, and most critically, the willing sacrifice of human blood from individuals who understood the spiritual significance of what they were doing and who chose consciously to offer their life force as payment for maintaining the barrier between dimensions. The second major incident that confirmed al-Nasiri's warnings and demonstrated that the situation was deteriorating far more rapidly than anyone had anticipated came at approximately 0345 hours on October 9th, when 3 additional soldiers stationed at various points around Firebase, Eden simultaneously collapsed with the same symptoms that had afflicted Private Martinez 7 hours earlier. Specialist James Crow Blackwater, a Native American combat engineer from Oklahoma, Corporal Lisa Mama Rodriguez, a vehicle mechanic from Texas with 2 children waiting for her back home, and Private First Class Samuel Prophet Cohen, an Army intelligence analyst from New York whose Jewish faith had made him particularly interested in the religious significance of operating near biblical Babylon. All 3 experienced sudden onset of the black eye possession phenomenon, their bodies seizing violently while temperatures spiked to dangerous levels and voices that were definitely not their own began speaking through mouths that formed words in languages ranging from ancient Akkadian to modern English, sometimes switching between tongues mid-sentence as if the possessing entities were still learning how to properly operate human vocal apparatus. What made this second wave of possessions exponentially more terrifying than Martinez's initial case was the fact that the 3 new victims had been stationed at different locations across the Firebase with no physical proximity to the excavation site or to each other, suggesting that whatever had escaped through the compromised seal was no longer confined to a localized area, but had gained the ability to move freely throughout the compound, selecting victims based on criteria that remained unclear, but which Chaplain O'Connell grimly suggested might be related to the strength of the individual's religious faith, as all 4 possessed soldiers had been noted in personnel files as actively practicing their respective religions and regularly attending worship services when available. The possessed soldiers began exhibiting coordinated behavior that eliminated any remaining doubt about whether they retained consciousness or military training under the influence of whatever entities had taken control of their bodies. Rather than acting as mindless monsters or causing random destruction, the 4 worked together with disturbing efficiency, using hand signals and tactical communication that demonstrated they understood military protocols and could apply infantry squad tactics despite theoretically being controlled by beings that predated organized warfare by millennia. Lieutenant Morrison observed through security camera footage as the possessed individuals moved through Firebase Eden systematically, approaching other soldiers and attempting what appeared to be recruitment or conversion, reaching out to touch fellow troops while speaking in that characteristic multi-voice chorus, "Join us. The flesh is so warm after eternity in cold darkness. Let them in. Become doorways. There is room for thousands more." Several soldiers who were touched by the possessed quartet reported feeling overwhelming compulsions to approach the excavation site, describing the sensation as though invisible hooks had been embedded in their chests and were physically dragging them toward the sealed stone slab that pulsed now with visible heat distortion, rising from the covered soil. Captain Garrett made the immediate decision to place the entire Firebase on lockdown, ordering all personnel to arm themselves and establishing a quarantine perimeter around the 4 possessed soldiers with shoot-to-kill authorization if they attempted to spread whatever spiritual contagion had compromised their bodies. Though the captain privately acknowledged to Lieutenant Morrison that he had no confidence, bullets would actually stop entities that had already demonstrated the ability to enhance human bodies beyond normal physiological limitations, and which seemed to treat physical pain as merely an interesting novelty rather than a deterrent to continued action. The complete collapse of Firebase Eden's defensive integrity began at precisely 0847 hours on October 9th, when the stone slab covering the ancient seal finally fractured completely under sustained pressure from below, splitting along the cuneiform inscriptions with a sound like thunder, echoing from underground caverns that shouldn't exist in the relatively shallow geological formations beneath the Mesopotamian plain. Captain Garrett watched through binoculars from the command post as the covered excavation site literally exploded outward, tons of soil launching into the air as if propelled by compressed gas escaping from a ruptured container. And when the debris settled, what remained was a perfectly circular opening approximately 5 meters in diameter that descended into darkness so absolute it seemed to absorb light rather than merely reflecting an absence of illumination. From this newly opened portal emerged a heat that was immediately detectable, even from 200 meters away. Waves of thermal energy that created visible distortion in the air, and which carried with them a stench that combined sulfur-burning hair and something that reminded multiple soldiers of the smell inside slaughterhouses, where blood had been left to rot in Middle Eastern heat for days beyond any reasonable sanitation timeline. But far worse than the physical manifestations was the sound that began emanating from the opening. A chorus of voices numbering in the dozens or perhaps hundreds, all speaking simultaneously in languages both ancient and modern, creating a cacophony that bypassed normal hearing and seemed to resonate directly in the brainstems of everyone within Firebase Eden, making it impossible to think clearly or maintain focus on tactical necessities, while the voices whispered promises and threats and memories of sins committed by soldiers who thought their actions in combat would remain secret between them and whatever god they prayed to for forgiveness. The 4 previously possessed soldiers, Martinez, Blackwater, Rodriguez, and Cohen, suddenly stopped their attempted recruitment activities and turned in perfect synchronization toward the newly opened portal, their black eyes reflecting the red glow that had begun pulsing from deep within the chasm, like a massive heartbeat made of fire and darkness. They began walking toward the opening with mechanical precision, moving in a diamond formation that any infantry instructor would have recognized as a standard tactical approach to an objective. And when Captain Garrett ordered his soldiers to physically restrain them before they could reach the portal, the possessed quartet demonstrated combat capabilities that exceeded anything in their service records or training evaluations. Private Martinez, who had been a barely adequate marksman, scoring 23 out of 40 during his last rifle qualification, somehow acquired an M4 rifle and began engaging targets with precision that would have qualified him as an expert sniper, placing shots within inches of soldiers' heads while the multiple voices speaking through his mouth taunted them in perfect English. "We remember your wars, Sumerians and Akkadians, Babylonians and Persians, Greeks and Romans, Mongols and Ottomans. Always you kill each other over this ground. Your violence feeds us, your suffering sustains us. We have learned all your tactics by watching through the veil. Now we will teach you what real warfare means when soldiers cannot die, because they are already inhabited by those who defeated death itself." The situation escalated into complete nightmare when additional soldiers began collapsing with possession symptoms, not just 1 or 2 at a time, but rather in waves of 5, then 10, then 15 individuals simultaneously experiencing the black eye phenomenon and demonstrating immediate transformation from loyal American troops into coordinated units serving an intelligence that had spent millennia studying human warfare from its underground prison. Lieutenant Morrison, maintaining her analytical focus even as chaos erupted around her, recognized a disturbing pattern in the selection of possession victims. The entities were specifically targeting soldiers with the strongest religious convictions, those who prayed regularly, who wore crosses or stars of David or carried Qurans in their rucksacks, as if the imprisoned demons fed on faith itself and found the most devout individuals to be the most suitable vessels. Because their spiritual openness created psychological vulnerabilities, that could be exploited more easily than the skeptical or atheistic soldiers who maintained no conscious connection to supernatural realities. Chaplain O'Connell, watching his most faithful congregants become possessed one by one, while soldiers who never attended services remained unaffected, experienced a crisis of faith that manifested as both theological despair and tactical fury, screaming at God for allowing evil to wear the faces of good people who had done nothing but believe sincerely and pray honestly for protection that clearly wasn't coming from any heavenly source. Private First Class Angel. Martinez's consciousness made one final desperate attempt to communicate with his fellow soldiers before being completely subsumed by the entity that had claimed his body as a permanent vessel, managing to force his own voice to the surface for approximately 15 seconds of clarity, during which he conveyed information that would prove crucial for understanding what was actually happening beneath Firebase Eden. Speaking rapidly in Spanish that was translated by Corporal Rodriguez moments before she too succumbed to possession, Martinez explained that the entities weren't demons in the traditional Christian or Islamic sense, but rather something older than those religious frameworks, beings that had existed before humanity and which had been imprisoned specifically because they possessed the ability to inhabit physical matter and use biological vessels to experience sensations and exercise will in ways that pure spirit cannot. And the Tower of Babel, according to what Martinez claimed the entities had shown him, through forced visions downloaded directly into his consciousness, hadn't been destroyed by God for the hubris of reaching heaven, but rather had been a deliberate prison construction project commissioned by something the entities called the First Ones, who had recognized that these particular beings posed an existential threat to the stability of material reality itself, because their nature was to consume and corrupt and transform everything they touched, turning order into chaos and life into a mockery of existence that served no purpose except feeding an insatiable hunger that had no endpoint or satisfaction threshold. The Firebase's perimeter defenses began failing systematically as the possessed soldiers, now numbering over 40 individuals out of the original company's strength of 140 troops, demonstrated not just retained military training, but rather enhanced tactical awareness that suggested they could perceive the battlefield in ways human senses couldn't detect, anticipating movements before they occurred, and coordinating attacks with precision that indicated some form of telepathic communication or shared consciousness among all the possessed vessels. Sergeant Davidson, one of the few senior NCOs who remained unaffected by the possession phenomenon, found himself fighting a desperate defensive action against soldiers who had been his friends and colleagues hours earlier, forced to make impossible decisions about when to use lethal force against Americans who wore the same uniform and served the same flag, but whose bodies had been hijacked by entities that retained enough of the original personalities to make individual victims recognizable, even as they attacked with inhuman coordination and merciless efficiency. Most devastating was the moment when Corporal Mama Rodriguez, possessed but still bearing her characteristic facial expressions and mannerisms, approached a young private who had served in her vehicle maintenance section and spoke to him in her own voice, using specific memories and inside jokes that only the real Rodriguez could have known, convincing the soldier to lower his weapon and accept her embrace, which triggered immediate possession the moment physical contact was established, and added another vessel to the growing army of compromised troops. The climax of the supernatural assault came when the portal that had opened at the excavation site suddenly expanded, the circular opening widening from 5 meters to nearly 20 meters in diameter, as more of the surrounding soil collapsed into the chasm, revealing that the darkness below wasn't simply an absence of light, but rather a physical substance, a liquid shadow that flowed upward against gravity and began spreading across the Firebase compound, like sentient fog that moved with obvious purpose and intelligence. This darkness touched everything in its path and left corruption behind, causing metal to rust instantly, causing plants to wither into ash, and most horrifically, causing any soldier who was enveloped by the shadow to drop immediately into full possession without the gradual progression that earlier victims had experienced, their eyes turning black within seconds, and their voices joining the multi-toned chorus that now dominated all audio communication across Firebase Eden's radio networks. Captain Garrett, realizing that conventional military responses were proving worse than useless and that his remaining unaffected troops numbered fewer than 60 soldiers out of the original 140, made a desperate decision based on the information Professor Al-Nasiri had provided about the ancient sealing rituals requiring willing sacrifice of human blood from individuals who understood the spiritual stakes involved in their choice. The captain, whose nickname, Shepherd, had come from his habit of quoting the Bible, and whose faith had survived every horror of modern warfare, up until this moment when he watched good soldiers become vessels for ancient evil, understood that the original Babylonian seals hadn't been created through prisoner executions or animal sacrifices, but rather through the willing deaths of priests and soldiers who chose consciously to offer their life force as payment for protecting future generations from threats that transcended normal human conflicts and which required a type of courage that had nothing to do with facing enemy fire and everything to do with accepting spiritual annihilation for a cause that would never be recorded in any history book or honored with any medal or memorial. Captain Garrett's decision to implement the ancient sealing ritual based on Professor Al-Nasiri's translations of Sumerian texts required him to do something that violated every principle of military leadership and every instinct about protecting the soldiers under his command, but which represented the only possible solution for preventing the demonic outbreak from spreading beyond Firebase Eden to potentially infect the entire coalition military presence in Iraq, and eventually the world beyond. The captain gathered the remaining 60 unaffected soldiers in the command post and explained with brutal honesty what the ancient texts required. 7 individuals would need to voluntarily sacrifice themselves, standing at specific positions around the portal's perimeter, while speaking binding formulas in reconstructed Sumerian language and allowing their blood to flow into the contaminated soil, creating a spiritual circuit that would force the escaped entities back into their underground prison and restore the integrity of seals that had been compromised by modern ignorance of ancient warnings. Garrett made clear that he wasn't ordering anyone to volunteer, that this decision had to be made freely with full understanding that death was guaranteed, and that the method would be both painful and spiritually significant in ways that transcended normal concepts of military sacrifice, requiring each volunteer to consciously offer not just their physical life, but potentially their eternal soul, as payment for maintaining barriers that protected humanity from threats it no longer believed existed and therefore couldn't defend against through conventional means. The response to Garrett's call for volunteers demonstrated both the courage and the faith that had made these particular soldiers targets for possession in the first place, with over 20 individuals immediately stepping forward, despite knowing exactly what was being asked of them, and understanding that their sacrifice would likely never be acknowledged officially or honored publicly, because the entire incident would be classified at levels that prevented even family notification of the true circumstances of their deaths. Among the first to volunteer was Chaplain Major O'Connell, whose crisis of faith had paradoxically strengthened his resolve by forcing him to confront the reality that spiritual warfare required more than prayers and holy water, that sometimes God's protection came through the willing sacrifice of believers who understood that their deaths could serve purposes that transcended individual survival or even their hope for salvation. Sergeant Davidson stepped forward despite having no particular religious convictions, explaining simply that he had been the one operating the backhoe that broke the seal and therefore bore responsibility for the consequences of that action. A sense of accountability that represented military honor in its purest form. Staff Sergeant Smith, the combat medic who had spent years saving lives through medical skill and scientific training, volunteered because she recognized that some threats couldn't be addressed through conventional medicine and required healers to expand their understanding of what constitutes treatment when the disease is spiritual rather than biological. The remaining volunteers included Lieutenant Morrison, whose academic knowledge of ancient cultures made her uniquely capable of properly pronouncing the Sumerian binding formulas. Private Hayes, the young sentry who had first detected the breathing sounds from beneath the seal, and who felt personal obligation to help close what he had helped discover. And 2 soldiers whose names would be struck from all official records, but whose sacrifice would be remembered by the survivors as acts of pure courage that saved not just their fellow troops, but potentially the entire world from an outbreak of possession that would have spread exponentially as each new victim became a vector for infecting others through the simple act of physical contact. The ritual itself, as Professor Al-Nasiri directed through radio communication, while maintaining safe distance from the Firebase perimeter, required the 7 volunteers to position themselves at equal intervals around the portal's edge, forming a heptagon that corresponded to the 7 judges of the Mesopotamian underworld and the 7 seals that King Nebuchadnezzar had commissioned to contain the imprisoned entities. Each volunteer was required to cut their own flesh using blades that had been heated in flame until they glowed red. The combination of fire and blood representing the dual elements that had created the original seals, and which alone possessed the power to restore barriers between dimensions when properly applied with conscious intent and willing sacrifice. As the volunteers began speaking the binding formulas that Morrison had transliterated phonetically from Al-Nasiri's translations, their voices combining into a counter-harmony against the multi-toned chorus still emanating from the possessed soldiers and the portal itself, the effect was immediately visible as the spreading darkness began retreating back toward the central opening, flowing in reverse like water being drawn down a drain, pulling with it the black substance that had contaminated the eyes of possession victims, and causing the affected soldiers to collapse as the entities were forcibly extracted from their borrowed vessels and dragged back into the underground prison from which they had escaped. The cost of the sealing became apparent as the ritual reached its conclusion, with all 7 volunteers experiencing rapid physiological deterioration that went far beyond normal blood loss or shock, their bodies aging decades within minutes as if the spiritual energy required to maintain the seal was being drawn directly from their life force, consuming not just their present vitality but also their future potential, burning through years they would never live in exchange for minutes of sustained connection to powers that human flesh wasn't designed to channel safely. Chaplain O'Connell was the first to fall, collapsing at his position around the portal's edge, while still speaking the Sumerian words, his final prayer, a combination of Christian liturgy and ancient Babylonian binding formula that created a bridge between religious traditions separated by millennia, but united in their recognition that some evils required sacrifice to contain. Sergeant Davidson lasted longer, his voice growing weaker but never faltering in the pronunciation of syllables he couldn't understand, but which carried power that resonated in frequencies felt rather than heard. His death coming with the quiet dignity of a soldier who had accepted his fate and found meaning in an end that served purposes larger than his individual survival. One by one, the volunteers fell silent as their hearts stopped and their blood completed the circuit around their bodies, lying in positions that would remain undisturbed by Captain Garrett's orders until the entire site could be sealed permanently through methods that combined both ancient ritual and modern engineering. The portal began closing as the final volunteer expired the massive circular opening, shrinking gradually as contaminated soil flowed back to fill the void. But the process wasn't instantaneous or smooth, creating moments where the imprisoned entities made desperate final attempts to maintain their connection to the physical world by speaking through the still possessed soldiers who hadn't been close enough to the ritual circle to be immediately freed from influence. Private Martinez, his consciousness having been completely subsumed during the earlier phases of the possession, suddenly regained enough of himself to deliver a final warning in his own voice before the entity holding him was dragged back underground. Captain, it's Sir Yum, they're not gone, just sealed again. But the seals are weaker now. The chemicals in the soil, Agent Orange and depleted uranium and all the other poisons we've pumped into this earth. It's breaking down the barriers and they'll get out again. Maybe in 50 years, maybe in 5. Tell someone, warn them. Don't let anyone dig here again. This ground is cursed and it's getting worse. Martinez's eyes cleared from black to their natural brown for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for him to smile in recognition of his captain and his fellow soldiers, before rolling back white as his brain shut down from the trauma of having hosted an entity that human neurology wasn't equipped to sustain. His death coming as a mercy that ended suffering no one should have been forced to endure. Captain Garrett surveyed Firebase Eden in the aftermath of the sealing, taking in the scope of devastation that would need to be explained through official reports that couldn't possibly tell the truth without being immediately dismissed as mass hallucination or combat stress-induced psychosis. Of the original 140 soldiers assigned to Bravo Company, 7 had died performing the sealing ritual. 32 had died during the possession outbreak, either from the physical trauma of hosting entities or from combat casualties inflicted by possessed troops fighting against unaffected personnel, and the remaining 101 survivors would need to be carefully debriefed and separated to prevent them from comparing stories and developing a unified narrative that contradicted whatever official explanation the Pentagon ultimately decided to provide. The portal itself had closed completely, leaving behind a circular depression approximately 3 meters deep that was filled with soil that had been fused into a glassy substance by the heat generated during the sealing process, creating a permanent scar on the landscape that would resist any attempted excavation and which would need to be marked with warning signs that somehow conveyed danger without explaining the true nature of what lay beneath. Most disturbingly were the 41 soldiers who had been possessed during the outbreak, but who survived after the entities were forced back underground, all of them unconscious and displaying symptoms that ranged from severe brain damage to catatonic states that suggested their consciousnesses had been so thoroughly violated by the possession experience that recovery to anything approaching normal function might not be possible, leaving the military with dozens of casualties who were technically alive, but functionally destroyed by trauma that no existing medical or psychiatric treatment had any framework for addressing. The official military report filed by Colonel Thomas Bradford, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, regarding the incident at Firebase, Eden, classified the entire event as catastrophic structural collapse during unauthorized excavation activities resulting in mass casualties from toxic gas exposure and subsequent combat stress reactions. And within 36 hours of the portal's sealing, every surviving member of Bravo Company had been evacuated from the site and dispersed to different medical facilities across 3 continents under quarantine protocols that prevented them from communicating with each other, their families, or anyone outside the classified investigation team that spent the next 6 months conducting interviews designed more to establish a consistent cover story than to discover truth that had already been documented through security camera footage, radio recordings, and physical evidence that would immediately be sealed in vaults requiring presidential authorization to access. The 7 soldiers who had volunteered for the sealing ritual were officially listed as killed in action during enemy indirect fire attack. Their bodies returned to their families in sealed caskets with strict instructions that opening them would violate federal law and risk contamination from unspecified chemical agents. The lie maintained so thoroughly that their loved ones would die, never knowing that their sons and daughters and husbands and wives hadn't been killed by insurgent mortars, willingly as spiritual sacrifices to reseal a portal to something that predated human civilization and which threatened existence itself. Firebase Eden was demolished within a week of the incident. Combat engineers using controlled explosives to level every structure before bulldozers covered the entire site with 3 meters of imported soil, followed by a concrete cap and finally a permanent military exclusion zone extending 500 meters in all directions around the former Firebase location, with armed guards stationed to prevent anyone from approaching the cursed ground where 7 heroes had bled out their lives to maintain barriers that most of humanity didn't believe existed and therefore couldn't properly honor or commemorate. Captain Michael Garrett was promoted to major and assigned to a position within the Defense Intelligence Agency's Special Access Programs Division, a posting that effectively ended his field command career and placed him in a bureaucratic role where he spent the next decade managing classified files related to what internal documents euphemistically termed anomalous combat incidents requiring non-standard response protocols. His task involved coordinating with similar incidents reported by military forces from other nations, discovering to his growing horror that Firebase Eden hadn't been an isolated occurrence, but rather represented one data point in a disturbing global pattern where military operations in archaeologically significant areas were triggering encounters with entities that seemed to have been deliberately imprisoned by ancient civilizations, who understood threats that modern society had forgotten or dismissed as mythology. Chaplain Major David O'Connell's sacrifice became legendary within the small community of military chaplains who possessed high enough security clearances to learn about spiritual warfare incidents that transcended traditional religious frameworks, with his name invoked during classified training sessions as an example of faith that manifested not through prayer alone, but through willingness to offer everything, including one's eternal soul, for the protection of others. a form of religious devotion that challenged comfortable theological assumptions about the nature of sacrifice and the true cost of confronting evil that wore no human face and operated according to rules that predated biblical revelation. The 41 soldiers who survived possession but emerged with severe neurological damage were quietly transferred to a specialized Veterans Affairs facility in rural Montana, where they could receive long-term care isolated from public scrutiny. Their families told they were suffering from traumatic brain injuries sustained during combat operations and requiring treatment at a secured location due to classified nature of the missions they had been conducting when injured. Medical personnel at this facility reported disturbing patterns among the patients, including synchronized episodes, where multiple individuals would simultaneously wake from catatonic states, speak in unison using languages they had never studied, and describe visions of underground darkness and imprisoned entities counting the years until SEALs would weaken enough to allow another escape attempt. The patients serving as unwilling oracles, providing intelligence about threats that military strategists had no doctrine for addressing, and which couldn't be countered through conventional force projection or technological superiority. Private First Class Angel Martinez, who had delivered the final warning about deteriorating SEALs before dying from possession trauma, became something of a prophetic figure within classified Pentagon circles, where analysts tracked his prediction about future breaches, noting with growing alarm that archaeological sites across the Middle East were showing signs of increased seismic activity and unexplained thermal anomalies in areas where ancient texts had described similar sealing rituals, to the one performed at Babylon, suggesting that Martinez's estimate of 50 years or 5 before the next major outbreak might prove optimistically long if the accelerating pace of environmental contamination and military activity in sacred sites continued degrading spiritual barriers at current rates. Professor Karim al-Nasiri, whose knowledge had provided the crucial information for performing the sealing ritual, disappeared from public record 3 months after the Firebase Eden incident, with some sources claiming he had been recruited into a classified research program, studying ancient containment methods and attempting to identify other at-risk sites where SEALs might be compromised before catastrophic breaches occurred. Other accounts suggested he had been silenced permanently by intelligence agencies who wanted to prevent him from sharing knowledge that could potentially be weaponized by adversarial nations or terrorist organizations seeking to deliberately release imprisoned entities as a form of asymmetric warfare that couldn't be attributed to any specific human actor, and which would create chaos that conventional military forces would be powerless to stop. The broader implications of the Firebase Eden incident extended far beyond a single military base in Iraq, raising questions that no government agency wanted to publicly acknowledge or address about the true nature of reality and humanity, his place within a universe that contained threats operating according to spiritual rules that science had no framework for measuring or predicting. If ancient civilizations had possessed knowledge about dimensional barriers and methods for imprisoning entities that modern society had dismissed as superstitious nonsense, what other warnings contained in religious texts and mythological traditions might represent genuine intelligence about existential dangers, rather than primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena through supernatural narratives? Perhaps most disturbing were the environmental analyses conducted at the Firebase Eden site in the years following the incident, which revealed that the soil composition within the exclusion zone showed progressive chemical changes that couldn't be explained through normal geological processes with mineral content, shifting in ways that suggested active contamination from unknown sources beneath the sealed portal. Satellite thermal imaging detected periodic heat signatures emanating from the location where the ritual had been performed, temperature spikes occurring at intervals that seemed to correspond with specific astronomical alignments referenced in ancient Mesopotamian calendars, as if whatever had been imprisoned beneath Babylon was still active and still attempting to exploit weaknesses in the restored seal through methods that operated according to celestial mechanics and spiritual geometries that modern science had no terminology for describing. What Captain Garrett and his soldiers had discovered during those 72 hours in October 2003 was something that challenged every comfortable assumption about the nature of evil, the reliability of faith, and humanity's control over the planet we inhabit. That beneath our feet, sealed in locations marked by ancient warnings that modern civilization ignores or dismisses, there exist entities that predate human history, and which possess the patience to wait millennia for the inevitable moment when seals weaken and barriers fail, allowing them to escape into a world that has forgotten how to fight spiritual battles, and which mistakes its technological advancement for genuine power over forces that operate according to rules we've convinced ourselves don't exist. The 7 heroes who volunteered for the sealing ritual understood something that most people never confront, and most soldiers never face, even in the worst combat situations. That some battles can't be won through superior firepower or tactical brilliance. That sometimes the only victory possible is buying time through sacrifice, delaying inevitable conflicts to give future generations opportunities to develop better solutions, or at least to enjoy a few more years of ignorant peace before being forced to confront truths that shatter every religious framework and scientific paradigm simultaneously. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the darkest corners of history. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any episodes. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel. Because believe me, we have many more stories about the things that go bump in the night and the soldiers or fools foolish enough to face them. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying battles are the ones that never made it into the history books.